Hi, my name's Anna Serin. I'm Director of Listings Development with the Canadian Securities Exchange, and you are joining us for yet another weekly market update. I am joined today by a guest co-host, Jordan Youl. He works with StoneCastle Investment Management. Thank you for joining us, Jordan.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Jordan he works with Bruce, and Bruce is getting a well-deserved week off. So hopefully he's enjoying himself. We have a lot to unpack this week. Let's talk about it. We're going to talk about markets as a whole. There were some record highs in the indices and what that means. We're going to talk about quadruple witching. We're going to explain what that is and how that affects the market. We're going to talk about a big merger that happened in Canada, or potential merger that happened in Canada between Rogers and Shaw. And then we'll get into NFT. This is a bit of a new asset class that we're starting to see, non-fungible tokens. And we'll finish off with the stimulus checks in the US are reaching US citizens' bank accounts and what that might mean. So why don't we jump right into it? Jordan, tell us about the markets as a whole. What's going on in the indices?
Yeah, it's been a great week for equity investors. Most of the global equity markets hit all-time highs this week. We continue to see weakness in technology. Case in point is the Dow Jones and the NASDAQ. The spread between the two indices this week is definitely evident of the rotation that's taking place between the growth and value sectors within the index. But what's really interesting and what we've been seeing for quite some time now is a shift in geographic leadership. So we have a chart. It's a relative rotation graph. It's a technical tool that we use at StoneCastle. And there's 4 quadrants. There's improving, leading, weakening, and lagging. And the takeaway is that the underlying constituents, you want them to be moving in a north-northeast direction above that horizontal axis, and preferably on the right-hand side of that vertical axis as well. So what we did is we put a chart together with 26 of the major global equity markets, and we've highlighted EWC, which represents Canada. And you can see that the constituent just rotated into the leading quadrant. Now, these trends last for multiple quarters. So as Canadian investors, this is definitely a positive development that is taking place right now. So on a relative scale, of the 26 global equity markets out there, Canada is one of the strongest right now. So that definitely bodes well for investors here in Canada. And we're really excited about the opportunities in Canada moving forward.
Well, that's pretty exciting. What happened with interest rates?
Yeah, so obviously, the Fed, came out on Wednesday. Obviously, as expected, rates were unchanged. The takeaway is that, the Fed remains quite dovish. It seems like they're a little bit more interested in economic growth as opposed to raising rates. Obviously, we're starting to see signs of inflationary pressure. And again, that's something that's not new. 10-year Treasury yields continue to increase. And on the flip side, we're starting to see bond markets deteriorate as well. If you want to look at TLT as an example, which is a 20-year US Treasury bond ETF, off its August high of last year, it's actually down 20%. So it's officially in a bear market. So obviously we'll have to keep our eye on that. But with rising interest rates or treasuries, that bodes well for commodities, right? We're starting to see, gold is starting to pick up somewhat a little bit. It's contracted and pulled back off its highs, but commodities still overall look pretty constructive. And then obviously financials bode well in this environment as well. And I think that's really one of the reasons why we're seeing financials and energy, 2 heavyweights in the TSX taking leadership. And that's also coincides with the narrative that Toronto is showing signs of relative strength to the US and other global equity markets.
Well, I think one thing that is for sure is we can expect to see governments just do whatever they can for economic recovery. So that's one thing that is pretty assumed in what we're going to see there. Tell us about the Dow theory. What's happening there?
Yeah, so it coincides with Jay Powell's comments on Wednesday that the economy is definitely improving. And at StoneCastle, we use a variety of different economic data points and indicators to really determine whether or not we feel a recession is imminent or what the economic backdrop is telling us. And the fact that both industrials and the transport index are hitting all-time highs is definitely a positive sign for equity and markets moving forward. but is also telling us that the economic backdrop is improving. So both indices are hitting all-time highs. They're in sync with one another, and that's very positive right now.
That's awesome. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about small caps, what all of this means for the small cap space.
Yeah, yeah. So, what we've seen, if you go back to the March low, coming off the March low and into April, we take a look at, what really led the market higher. And it was predominantly driven by the small to mid cap growth stocks, the cyclicals. That wasn't so much the case in 2019, but the small caps in particular have been really the driving force of the markets off the March low of last year. That trend is still intact. So that really bodes well for smaller to mid cap investors seeking opportunities for growth. And then if you take a look at the TSX small cap index and you compare it to the Vanguard total stock index, so the ETF is VT, it is showing positive relative strength. So the takeaway is that the TSX small caps have the strongest relative strength to most major global equity markets out there. And as equity investors, we want the small and mid caps to participate as the markets are hitting all-time highs. It'd be a little bit concerning if we're at all-time highs, but the market was being led by large cap defensives. That would typically signal that we're maybe at a topping pattern. We're not there yet. So we still believe that, despite an increase in volatility, this equity market has some legs left in it for sure.
That's pretty exciting for us. Let's talk about quadruple witching. If you're looking at any news feed, you're probably seeing that word and wondering what it is. I'm going to refer to my notes to explain it, then you're going to tell us what that means. So quadruple witching is essentially a day where derivatives of stock index futures, stock index options, and single stock futures all expire simultaneously. Typically, this creates heavy trading volume. So what are we seeing?
Yeah, exactly. So, if we go back, even last week, a lot of the sentiment indicators that we follow, whether it's the VIX or the put call ratio, was at pretty extreme levels. So from a contrarian standpoint, we were definitely seeing signs of complacency in the markets. And, when Powell spoke on Wednesday and the markets hit all-time highs, the VIX hit a 52-week low. So we're definitely due for, an uptick in volatility in the markets. We saw a little bit of that yesterday on Thursday, but today's the day, right? So every quarter it's quadruple witching where all of these contracts expire. And what that tells us, or what really it does to the market, is that the volume picks up by a considerable margin, typically in the final hour of the trading day. So with that, we expect an increase in volatility in the markets, as well as, we're approaching quarter end and the markets are rebalancing. So it should create some fireworks today. So it's something that we're watching very closely. But given the fact that the VIX has been at a 52-week low now, I wouldn't be surprised to see some increased volatility going into the close today and get some follow through next week.
Well, we record this just before market close, so it'll be interesting to see how this day plays out. So watch for that. Let's talk about the big merger that happened in Canada this week. This was announced on Monday. So there's probably been lots of chat about it, but Rogers has bid to purchase Shaw. And I think it would be, I think the purchase was offered for $20 billion. And this would make it, if this was approved, this would make it the second largest telecom service provider after Bell, and would be ahead of TELUS at that point. What does a big merger like this look like? How does this affect the markets?
Well, it does in a couple of ways. These are two massive companies in Canada. From a large cap perspective, it's widely held and owned by most Canadian investors. Whether you own, the TSX 60, it's widely held by investors in most client portfolios. It's interesting. I don't think it was, surprising. Shaw last year with, the talks of maybe going private. Over the last few years, there's been significant layoffs and voluntary packages. The fact that Rogers has been growing and expanding their presence in the West, even in Kelowna here. They've opened up office space here and they're hiring aggressively. So I don't think it was, too surprising. Obviously, it wasn't like a hostile takeover. It's going to create some synergies, obviously, between the two companies. It's going to create job growth and increase Rogers' presence in the West, obviously, with the 5G rollout. I know that they're investing a significant amount of money out west here to develop that. One concern or hesitation would be is just from a regulatory standpoint. There might be some pushback with the CRTC. There might be some revisions, from the offering, just with competitiveness and pricing with the other, with their peers, essentially. So we'll see how that plays out, but that will definitely take time. Either way, analysts love it. Both stocks have been upgraded. Both stocks have performed very well this week as well in light of the news. So it's definitely a positive sign for the two companies and for Canada overall. But yeah, it's going to take some time, and they're going to have to get over some regulatory hurdles before everything's finalized.
It'll be interesting to watch that play out. And like you said, it will affect most investors in some way, shape, or form. Most funds hold it in some way, one of the two. Okay, let's talk about NFTs. So James Black, who helps us produce this show, he brought this up a few weeks ago, and I said, what is that? So I'm going to explain it for our audience. It is a non-fungible token. So what this means is that it can't be recreated. It can't be replaced. It is via the Ethereum blockchain. And what it is essentially, it is digital art. So it can be music, it can be a photo, it can be art. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's gained a lot of traction in the market. There's a lot of interest. There's some big purchases, some big sellers, and Elon Musk almost got involved in it this week. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's definitely, one of those alternative asset classes that's gaining a lot of traction these days. Elon, like, obviously carries a lot of weight in the alternative space, especially the crypto. So on Monday, he tweeted a song about NFTs, and he actually posted it for sale. And there was a bid to buy that for over $1 million. So the demand is there. It's really interesting. I don't know if it's going to go away anytime soon, but he's one of many celebrities and athletes that are getting on the bandwagon. Lindsay Lohan came out yesterday, and she's going to be listing a variety of different of these on the Tron exchange. We don't really necessarily know what the content's going to be because it always varies. It's always going to be different, but it's definitely a trend that's going to continue to grow, and it's something that investors definitely want to get a piece of.
Well, I guess we all wondered what Lindsay Lohan's next career move would be, and this was it. So good for her. I think the best way to describe this is it's like a digital baseball card that you trade. And I've even heard that because it's on blockchain, you can own a portion of it. So we'll see how that comes to market. Let's finish off the day and talk about stimulus checks. So in the US, we talked about this last week with Bruce, the $1.9 trillion stimulus package that was issued. Checks are now arriving in the mail, but we have some anticipation of how that's going to affect the market in a few different ways. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so that's going to be really interesting. Obviously the stimulus checks are being deposited, this week and next week. Be interesting to see where that money goes. Obviously, what's going to drive the markets and the economy is through consumer spending. Be interesting if the Robinhood traders are buying Bitcoin or cannabis. Obviously, looking on the cannabis side, the retailers had tremendous growth when checks were issued in April. Colorado, California, and a few others, Nevada, where their sales increased by a considerable margin as a result of the stimulus checks. So we'll see if that happens this time around. But also, given the COVID restrictions and what's going on, if things do open up, we don't know if people are going to be spending, on travel or restaurants or, buying cannabis and partying and having a big get together. So we don't really know. So it'll be interesting to see over the next couple of weeks how that money is being spent.
It'll be interesting to see if the government allowed people to get stoned. So we'll watch and see what happens there. I mean, you kind of think it through and you think you get this check. There is still a lot of the US that's in some form of lockdown. And so both the investing because you're sitting at home. You can trade on your Robinhood account for nothing. And so those checks might go, and the markets are doing so well that there really has been a movement of investing in this kind of COVID life that we live, but also, access to cannabis in the States where it's still legal. So it'll be interesting to see that happen. I will also note that yesterday the SAFE Act I touched on this, I think last week with Bruce, it did go back, up for possibility yesterday. And that obviously has to do with the banking in the cannabis space. And I think that's a really important movement. It's a cash-based business that's billions of dollars in the US. So I'm hopeful that they're able to get that through because it'll impact a lot. Do you think that the SAFE Act will encourage further development in the cannabis space? Will it help it?
Without question. Yeah, absolutely. It's a catalyst that we've been focusing on for a couple of years now. Obviously, it had its support, but it wasn't included in the stimulus package last year, obviously with COVID and whatnot, but now it's been brought forward yesterday. So I understand that the language within the bill hasn't changed too much, but anyways, it's a significant tailwind for the sector and the industry as a whole moving forward.
I always found it so interesting. I know that you and Bruce, you have a cannabis fund, and he's had to do due diligence down in the US. And some of his stories about how the cash is managed at some of these facilities is really eye-opening. And, for safety, you hope that banks are allowed to participate for employees. What should we think about going into next week, Jordan?
Well, there's a lot of economic data next week. Obviously, starting last night, U.S. and China began talks. This is the first time they've got together since Biden took over. So we'll see what the aftermath is as a result of the discussions, last night and today. But in addition to, the economic data next week, Jay Powell has 3 public appearances next week as well. So we'll see what he says. And obviously, we're approaching quarter end as well, and we're going to be seeing earnings and a whole bunch of stuff. So we're really excited about the opportunity moving forward in the markets. But next week will be quite interesting for sure.
It very much will. I'm super interested to see what's going to happen after those talks between the US and China, and hopefully there's some reparation there. Thank you so much, Jordan, for joining me. You were a fantastic co-host. I'm sure we'll get to see you again when we let Bruce have time off in the future. Thank you again for joining me. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.